Hello again. It's been a while since my last post, and several things have happened in terms of my cycling. I got addicted to fixed gear riding, and last week I had my first time experience with Zwift. And being really into climbing, I did up the Zwift in 100% difficulty settings. So with a Wahoo kicker, you could actually feel the 14% gradients, the undulations and everything, and it made me realize some of the weaknesses that I have with my cycling, especially when I'm climbing, and that's the thing that I would like to address in this post. So you've probably heard the saying, "Power is power." It means that if you can generate 300 watts on the flats, then you should have no problems generating 300 watts climbing uphill. And I would like to address that because that isn't all true. There's a very big problem in that argument that power is power. It's not true. Let me explain. Um, First, with regard to my experiences in climbing, because I climb a lot. I climb gentle gradients. I climb really steep, like 25% gradients, sustained. A few weeks back, I did the alpaca climb, which is 14 kilometers, so an average gradient of 4%, and I did my functional threshold test in there, essentially an FTP test. I don't have any power meter, so I was just testing how high I can hold my heart rate, and then I'll just do a post-ride calculation of how much power I was generating. So I finished at 14-kilometer uphill in 42 minutes or something like that. And based on my calculations, I would have generated 230 watts for nearly an hour. And knowing that the road is really, really rough, like it's nearly gravel. It's just really rough. It could I could easily have done 240 watts if I had a real power meter then. And that was with a 4% gradient for nearly an hour, and my heart rate was at 176 sustained. So I know that that's the heart rate that I could hold. That's my functional threshold heart rate. Now the difference is that when I did up the Zwift last week, up the Zwift is 12.2 kilometers with an average gradient of 8.5%. I noticed that I could barely generate 200 watts the entire climb. The Smart Trainer only recorded 190 watts average, and that exposed a weakness, and also that exposed the truth behind power is power. It's not the entire story. Power isn't just power, and let me explain why that is. Power is being naive. The thing is, the force that we could generate is not unlimited. Let me explain. So supposing you have a 50 kilo weight and you're able to lift it a height of 1 meter in 1 second. Does that mean that if you're given a 100 kilo weight, are you able to lift it a height of 1 meter in 2 seconds? Because the power generated in both cases would be the same. So 50 kilo weight, 1 meter in 1 second, 100 kilo weight, 1 meter in 2 seconds would be the same power. Now, how about 150 kilo weight? Can you lift it a height of 1 meter in 3 seconds? That would be the same power. In the case of 150 kilo weight, I don't think you could even lift it off the ground. And And that's a problem when you are doing very steep climbs. Now, supposing your FTP is 300 watts. I'm not sure how you're able you measured your FTP, but let's say you were riding on the flats, or you're doing some kind of, you know, the usual thing where you generated 300 watts at a cadence of 90 RPM. So 90 RPM, 300 watts. I don't know what force you have to generate in your legs, but supposing you're now climbing, when the road pitches up, okay, there will come a point where you can no longer spin it at 90 RPM. Okay, maybe you can, but you'd have to shift to a lower gear so that you can maintain 90 RPM and maintain the same amount of force. But when the road gets really steep, the force that you can generate in your legs is actually limited. And when you run out of gears, it means that you'd be generating a much harder force, but your cadence would now have dropped. It's no longer 90 RPM. Sometimes you'd be lucky if you can maintain 50 RPM. In the case of like 25% gradients, anything 20% and higher, like maintaining even 60 RPM would be hard. Which means, you know, generating a force that no longer matches your 90 RPM, so your cadence drops to 60 RPM, but then if your cadence drops, it means that your force needs to be way up there to generate the same 300 watts. But that force, since your legs are limited, right, it means that the force would be lower at 60 RPM. It means that your 300 watts isn't 300 watts anymore. Okay? Power is only true if you are not limited in terms of how much force you can generate on your legs. And this is why steep climbs are so much harder. I could generate 250 watts on the flats, no problems at all. I can do that for an hour. But on a 10-12% gradient, 250 watts would be really hard for me, because it means I'd be pushing at a much higher force, and the cadence would definitely drop, maybe 60, 70. Right? Even if I use a 32 tooth cog at the back, on a 10%, 12% climb, that amount of force and a lower cadence, okay, you will tire, and then your power would drop. So 250 on the flats isn't the same as 250 when you're climbing. So power is not power. Right? So just to end this post, what's the consequence of everything that I've just discussed? Well, if your FTP is 300 watts when you were testing it on the flats, and then you try to hit the same numbers when you're doing a very steep sustained climb, say you try to hit the same 300 watts, you might be surprised that you would no longer be pushing at your FTP. Your effort would more likely VO2 max up to maybe anaerobic efforts. It means that if you're just thinking about, okay, I need to maintain my FTP to finish this 10% sustained climb, you may not make it to the top. Because 300 watts on the flats is very different from 300 watts when you're climbing very steep gradients. So be very careful. And that's it for this blog. Until next time.